This is Fantology.
You may have heard of us.
The Devils is the best book that Joe Abercrombie has written to date. Hard stop. I'll say it again, the best Joe Abercrombie book out there yet. And you should be very excited for it to come out in May of 2025. It's going to get a lot of noise for Best Fantasy of 2025. It's going to get a lot of flowers thrown at it, and frankly, it deserves it because this book is fantastic, lives up to the expectations, plus. Okay, let me follow up that bold claim with some reasons why. So if you're familiar with Joe Abercrombie, you know his first law books, which there are 9 of, plus some short stories. And this one is not a first law book. This is an entirely new series. And honestly, going into the book, I was not even sure. Was it a series? Was it a novel? I think there's a lot of kind of unknowns around this book because we're so used to the First Law brand around Joe Abercrombie. That said, it still has the Joe Abercrombie brand to it. It's got some bad language and violence and some adult themes, and it's grimdark, but is it quite as grimdark as his other books? I'll kind of touch on this in a little bit, but maybe Joe Abercrombie is no longer the young bad boy of British fantasy. The book itself is quite long, coming in at almost 700 pages, which I think from a cursory glance through his other titles is the longest Joe Abercrombie book we've had yet. However, you can really rip through this one. It does not feel nearly that long, which is always an awesome thing to say about a book. It's very much a quest fantasy a la Lord of the Rings, where at the beginning of the book we have a defined thing that we're trying to accomplish and a set of characters, and off we go, and chaos follows. Joe has written some other books like this, like Before They Are Hanged and Best Served Cold, and once again, he has a very deft hand at this type of plot. Now, there is a very noticeable difference between The Devils and Joe's other first law books, and I'll refer back to his 2024 in review to define this. He says he's taken much more of a gardening approach, and that these books are self-consciously wild and chaotic. And gardening is a term that authors use to say that it's not so structurally rigid and defined by events in the plot that need to happen. Rather, he defines a set of characters and just kind of lets them go and see what happens. It's much more of a Wheel of Time-esque Robert Jordan type of thing. Now, there were a lot of things that I really liked about this book, which I'll get to later, of course, without spoilers for this video. But by the end, I found that my favorite part was reflecting upon the thematic and philosophical elements of the book. I think that's a sign of an excellent book, an excellent piece of literature, even, is that by the end, the author is not trying to convince you and bludgeon you with his or her worldview, but instead has laid out a bunch of things and let the reader kind of pick up the pieces and decide what they think about the themes and what the point of the book even is. Specifically in The Devils, we're talking about the nature of good and evil and religion and what is it to define what's good and evil and what are the actions that are requisite to say what someone is or isn't. And I found this to be a really fascinating and enlightening discussion on the topic, something that is certainly not a new idea, but it has a nice nuanced take here in the book. Like the heroes that we saw weren't necessarily super heroic. In this case, we have the devils, and are they really all that devilish? It's up for the reader to decide. Okay, let's talk some specific elements here. Again, no spoilers, but just things like setting, plot, no plot details, but what can we expect? What is kind of the thing that's happening here? Who are some of the characters? Things that you find out from the first few pages. We are in an alternative Europe, an alternative European setting. There is magic, there are magical creatures. The magic is very soft and kind of feels like your classical Tolkien-esque like magic, where there are different branches of magic: necromancy, thaumaturgy, aeromancy, geomancy, all the different elements, and they're kind of hand wavy, and there's no real like rhyme or reason as to who can do the magic. Not nearly as hard of a magic system as Brandon Sanderson, who actually had a funny experience because I was reading Wind and Truth at the same time as The Devils and talk about two very different books in the way they're structured. Both very good. I'm not going to crap or creme on Wind and Truth, but I think I might have liked The Devils a little bit better. Alternative Europe also means alternative history, so we have fun things like Troy's never fallen and is now this bastion of the eastern part of the world, one of the two centers of religion. Elves are super evil and monstrous, and we have to have these crusades against them in order to protect humanity. The Christ/Savior figure is a woman, which has caused massive ripples through the church and the theology. And if you can't tell, religion is a big part of the themes of the book. And I think that Joe does it with a really balanced, nuanced hand, where we're not just dismissing religion out of hand, which I appreciate as a religious person, but instead we get views between those who are both religious and not religious, and we kind of, you get to make up your own mind. And I think both sides have some valid points, and at the end of the day, we arrive at a fair and balanced look into what is religion, what are the good and bad parts of it. The feel of the world is just this wild and chaotic and zany type thing. It's got pretty similar feels to First Law, except that there's a lot more magic that's front and center, and there's a lot more magical creatures that are just popping in. And so anything can really kind of happen, and that's part of the appeal. There are rules, and that there are not a whole lot of rules, and it works. I think there has to be a lot of work behind the scenes in order to make this type of thing feel earned when magic happens, even when there's no rules, but Joe does a pretty good job. And then final note on the setting is there are just a few funny things where he kind of makes fun of England, and seems like anything that comes out of England is just stupid and dumb, and that's just totally, Joe British humor on point. The plot is a lot of things just kind of happening, but it totally works. There is, of course, some structure to it, and the structure kind of feels like Best Served Cold, where we're getting to specific checkpoints, but the stuff in between is just kind of meandering around and gardening, but it just totally works. And I think this is a sign of a great author when he can convince you that it's all like this master plan, but I think behind the scenes is just kind of the characters exploring and figuring out what they would do in these situations, and it's very fun. Now with that, there are some fantastic set pieces and fantastic action parts. Abercrombie is one of our best action writers out there in fantasy, and he does not disappoint here. I want to say there are like 3, 4, maybe just like extended scenes that just keep on going and building and are very exciting and just impossible to put down. Towards the end, there were a couple twists. One I felt was fairly obvious. Another was really good. So, okay marks there. For Joe Abercrombie, the plot has never been like the main thing that I enjoy about the book. It's more the vibes and the adventure and what we're doing in between the big plot events. And if I had to rank all of these elements, I'd say the plot is still probably on the weaker end. And especially as I was reading Wind and Truth at the same time, where Sanderson's best part is the world building and the plot, and he doesn't always do great in the stuff in between. So two very different authors. But I mean, overall, like the plot that was presented here was quite good, just not quite as good as the other elements. Once again, the prose from Joe Abercrombie was clever. I cannot say enough about the witticism and just pure intelligence that goes into his writing. I think he's our best living fantasy writer when it comes to prose. Rothfuss is in there as well, but they write very different styles, and Rothfuss hasn't written anything for a while, so I'm going to go with Abercrombie. And every single sentence and paragraph is just structured in unique and fun ways. It's always a joy to read, and it just totally adds to the story because everything has this additional layer of like the author is almost a character and telling the story in these fun ways. There are also a few fun little callbacks to First Law without, being on the nose at all. There are some Stair complaining. There are some grumblings of Steel being alive. And there's even a little remark about twists being surprising yet inevitable, which I already called out as a Sanderson thing. So I think kind of behind the scenes, just having a lot of fun with this writing. I talked about the themes already. I'm not going to rehash that, but I will be interested to see what others think about the grimdark nature of this book. I believe it to be less grimdark than any of his other First Law books. But again, that is my own opinion derived from the nuance, the presentation of the themes of good and evil, etc. I feel like there's just a little more hope of goodness in this book. And I don't want to do any spoilers for why that may be, but I think that it's very cleverly presented, and I wonder if others will agree with me. The pacing may have been one of the weaker elements of the book. It started off fairly quickly, introducing the characters and the quest, and then we were just off full throttle for like the first 60 to 70% of the book. And then it kind of came to a screeching halt for like 70 to 80%-ish. And it reset things and set up the Act 3, and then the Act 3 was amazing, but I do wonder if maybe it could have been woven in a little bit better so we didn't have this just it really felt like a crashing halt there right before the final part. And I mean, it wasn't terrible. It was still great writing, and it set things up very well, and it paid things off. But at the same time, maybe a little more interweaving so we don't have such a jarring slowdown. Characters, I don't know how I left characters to the end, because once again, Joe has assembled a great cast of characters that all seem very real and very, very well realized. There is an arrogant necromancer, a suave vampire, a cursed knight, a reluctant princess, amongst others. Not all of the 8 get point of views, but most of them do, and there's a nice interweaving of the passing off of the point of views. Each chapter is a different one, sometimes the same back to back, but it's always kind of this give and take of who's going to be the best voice for the next chapter, the next leg of the story. Oftentimes they're together, sometimes separated. I think together is almost harder, because then it's like, well, they're all together. Who am I going to decide is the best to tell this story? But it's fantastically done. I think this cast of characters is just very fun throughout. They have great dynamics. They play off each other very well. If I had to rank them, I'd say 5 of the 8 get A's for me. 3 of the 8 get B's. No marks lower than that. Although I do kind of wonder at the end of the book, where are we going from here? It's a good ending. I think it's a very solid ending for a first entry into a book, but the second book could pick up in just so many different ways, and I am not really sure what to expect. Although I do suspect that I will love it. Okay, all of that said, I'm giving The Devils a 9 out of 10, my very favorite Joe Abercrombie work, as he continues to climb the ladder of my favorite authors. Previously, it was Sanderson and Robert Jordan as 1A and 1B, but The Devils elevates Joe Abercrombie up into that one tier, that S tier for me. So it's 1A, 1B, 1C. I might have to even consider how I'm going to rank them, because this book was just so much fun. I have big expectations for the rest of the series. Bravo, Joe Abercrombie. Once the book comes out in May, we will do full spoiler coverage and have a full talk through. And man, would I love to get him on for an interview leading up to the release of the book. So if you can hype me in any way to get a conversation with Joe, that would be fantastic. Thanks for watching. See you later.